Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In this episode of our History 102 series, we do America and Conservatism after 1965. So liberalism that we talked about in a previous lecture of 1945 to 1965 was built on a couple of foundations. The first was economic wealth and job security. The idea that America was getting richer, corporations were getting richer, workers, especially union workers, were getting richer. And those union workers had job security. They didn't worry about their jobs going off to Asia. They didn't worry about the mines closing down. They didn't have to worry. They could have a job for 20 years, retire, and get a pension. 2, U.S. foreign policy was to spread freedom and democracy. In Europe, in the colonial worlds of Africa and South Asia, the idea was the U.S. was good and its foreign policy would spread freedom and democracy. Now, in reality, it didn't always do that, as the United States supported plenty of dictators, and we'll talk about that in the Cold War section. But the idea was freedom and democracy. 3, a patriarchal, traditional, conservative home life. A masculine job, a house, kids, a dog, the right to vote, especially in local elections and communities that would serve political functions. Is that the idea that people should have all these things. It was patriarchal. It was going to be run by a man. It was fairly traditional. It looked like families of the previous 100 years. It was fairly conservative. It was a nuclear family, which was kind of new. But it was the father had the job, the mother raised the kids went to school, they had a house with a little bit of property, and a dog or a cat. Take a look at the Flintstones. The Flintstones are not a wildly progressive family. They're a fairly conservative one. But by 1965, and especially by 1968, and definitely by 1972, this whole system was coming apart. Youth culture was taking over. Rock and roll, marijuana, long hair, sex. The anti-Vietnam War protests were filling the streets. There was black riots against poverty following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. American manufacturing was starting to either fail against competition from Germany and Japan, or it was moving overseas. We see this especially in clothing industries or in steel production because of either cheaper foreign competitors or to open up factories in cheaper labor markets. So by 1972, that whole idea that liberalism was based upon, the whole success of 1945 to 1965 was coming apart. So what does conservatism want post-1965? It's lost. Remember, we talked about it, how it more or less lost after the First World War. It definitely lost after the Second World War and the Great Depression. You know, the traditional way of doing things just didn't work. That's how you get the New Deal. That's how you get all these changes in the society. Well, the first thing is pro-nationalism. And what is meant is not just pro-America, but a very pro-white dominant theme. The founders were great. Manifest destiny is the way America was supposed to happen. America is good. Was slavery bad? Sure, but we fixed that 150 years ago, and we solved racism in 1965. So it's time to move on. It's very much the founders were great. That America had problems, but we fixed them. And this is the education world I grew up in. It's a very white dominated world. You didn't talk about slavery or Jim Crow or segregation. You didn't talk about genocide. You never use the word genocide for what happened to the Native Americans. You talked about manifest destiny. You talk about pioneers. You talk about expansion. You talk about spreading democracy and freedom. 2, pro-military. Big budgets. Big rhetoric. Loved all the symbols of the military. But doesn't like actual fighting. Conservatism after 1965 is big on the budget and big on being pro-military and support the troops and God save the troops, and then not wanting to use that army anywhere. That will change under George W. Bush, but in the 1980s, for all of Reagan's rhetoric, he never commits the army to a major war. George H.W. Bush invaded Panama to have what we would call today regime change. But his use of the military in the first Gulf War was also supported by the UN and a coalition of something like 50 other countries. So the idea of going into a, say, Vietnam, more or less all by yourself, was not conservatism post-1965. 3, pro-police. The police were going to be the method of stopping disorder. And disorder was all over the place. So a lot of investment in riot and SWAT teams and militarization of police in the late 60s. They were going to beat up young white college kids and liberal college kids and black people. That's what their job was. And we see this kind of come to fruition at Kent State in 1970, where 4 young people were shot. In 1968 at the Chicago Democratic Convention, where the police just went in and just beat the hell out of all kinds of young people who were protesting. You know, we see this in the post Martin Luther King Jr. assassination riots, where the police just kind of beat up people. So, and the conservatism, especially under Nixon, but under the more right parts of the Nixon administration, said that's great. That's great. The police are there to protect white property, adult white property. You know, and so if boomers are getting in the way, if kids are getting in the way, boomers are getting in the way, young boomers, or black folk are rioting, quote unquote, then they have they get what's coming to them. 4, anti-guns if black people buy them, but pro-guns if working class whites buy them. This is kind of the start of the NRA being a political force in the early 70s. It's the idea that black folks start arming themselves. This is kind of overly dramatized, but became the focus of the Black Panthers walking around in California with open carry rifles and shotguns. That the idea is after Martin Luther King's assassination, black people were going to have to arm themselves to protect themselves from white institutions. That was bad. So there's a bunch of laws against carrying guns in the open, against possessing certain kinds of guns. But there's also the feeling that, you know, if rural white folk want to have guns, they should. And the definition was to, quote, protect themselves. The question, of course, is protect themselves from who? Or whom, I should say. And the answer was the rioting black folk on the TV. Not their neighbors. Not the people in their town. In rural Pennsylvania, that crime was not a problem in rural Pennsylvania. But it was the fear that crime would be a problem that you start to see working class white folks start to arm themselves. 5. Also a pro-Protestant Christianity, especially fundamentalist, with very patriarchal interpretations of the proper role of societies, of the proper role of men and the proper role of women. This makes sense because these are the groups, these church groups, white, Protestant, especially Southern, evangelical church groups are the ones that are going to power Ronald Reagan, especially to the presidency. This alliance that comes back together that we talked about the 1920s. And so, of course, it's going to be pro that. It's not very good on Catholics. It's not very good on conservative Jews. There is no love for Buddhist or Muslim religious people. It is very Protestant, very Southern, very evangelical, which makes sense because conservatism post-1965 is going to be based, as we saw in the maps, in the old Confederacy, basically, and it's going to radiate out from there. That's where the voting base will be. So there's a desire to go back to the 1920s, a conservative, religious, rural values, but also, and this is where the money comes from to support the candidates and such, to allow big business the freedom from taxes and unions and regulations. We see this in the philosophy of Milton Friedman, the economist, who will win a Nobel Prize, as an anti-Keynesian. And the idea is Milton Friedman's basically arguing the markets can work themselves out, especially when you're not in a depression. When things are good, you don't need Keynes. I don't know Milton Friedman's work enough to know if he even admits that Keynes works in a depression. But his argument is definitely when you're not in a depression, when things are good, let businesses do their thing. Don't get in the way of it. And this is a philosophy that goes back to Adam Smith. This is why it's called neoliberalism, and it's the only thing that's conservative, but actually called liberal, because the liberalism goes back to Adam Smith when you're talking about the economy should be independent of the king. And it was liberal in 1776 to have an economy independent of the king. And so now it's a conservative idea. Less taxes, less regulations, less power for unions, less negotiating power for unions. And you get the rise of what's called right-to-work states. This is a very Orwellian, the idea that the right to work is the right to work outside of a union and to be paid less. And again, this starts very much in the South and then in the upper Midwest, in the very rural conservative places. So, the inventor of kind of modern American conservatism is William F. Buckley. And he has a definition that is pretty much the one we're using. A conservative is someone who stands athwart history yelling stop. And the idea of this is very much not regression, not revanchist, not to return to a better time, but simply things are good. It's very Burkean. Things are good. Stop. Stop changing. Stop experimenting. Things are fine the way they are. Now, there's some problems in Buckley's conservatism, and thus in the modern American conservatism, especially early on. Now, those who will say, Buckley changes and becomes literally more liberal as time goes on, but we see these strains today. They are still part of conservatism today, and you see them in the Congress, you see them in the Senate, you see them in the ads. And the first is, it's anti-Semitic. Buckley's first book is about anti-Jewish commie teachers at Yale. It's the idea that college professors are indoctrinating kids with liberal ideas. And a lot of those professors happen to be Jews teaching communism. So it's from the very beginning anti-Semitic. There's an anti-Semitic, and this is one reason why Jewish groups are so tied to the civil rights groups. And you see this even in the comedy of like Dave Chappelle or especially Chris Rock, the idea that black folk and Jewish folk are linked. They have to be linked because that when white people talk about making America great again, a lot of it is taking rights away from black folk. And then after them, it's the Jewish folk that aren't really American. They're not really one of us. And this is a insult to Jewish Americans that goes all the way back to when they started to show up. It is exactly the kind of argument that was made by the fascist party leaders in the 1930s. You know, the right, the very conservative of conservatives. So there's still this strain. 2, it's anti-gay. In fact, Buckley, in a very famous debate with Gore Vidal, called him "you queer," right on TV, which is just, it's undignified. It's gross. You know, Buckley called him a fascist, and he called him a queer. You know, I don't have to listen to you. You're gross. You do something with your Willy Wonka that, you know, is bad, is gross, is not normal, is sick. And so conservatism from the very beginning is anti kind of gay. It's, why don't you just get married and have a regular family? Remember, it's a patriarchal, it believes in the patriarchal family. It believes in a man and a woman and kids, and the man runs the house and the woman raises the kids. And we see that in the debates in the 2000s. That was the same argument, the argument that marriage is between a man and a woman. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. You know, that kind of, that makes it all simplistic, but there's this, especially in the early 60s, 50s, into the 60s and into the 70s, this kind of gay people are sick. And they're not really American. They're pro-dictators. Buckley loved Franco. Mussolini was okay in the 20s. It's when he starts hooking up with Hitler that in the 30s things go bad. It's the idea that America needs less democracy. It needs less people voting. It needs less of the wrong people voting. You need tighter voting restrictions. You need to make sure there's quote unquote free and fair elections. You don't, that there's no lots of cheating going on. Well, who's cheating? Well, those people, not our people, but those people are cheating. The other black, brown people, Jewish people, liberals, young people, they're trying to take over. Because there's this idea that there's no way they're the majority. They can't be the majority. So they love a strong man, especially a strong man in uniform. So there's always this search for a military leader, kind of a new Douglas MacArthur who might lead conservatism. Is it racist? Well, Buckley will eventually kick out the neo-Nazis and the KKK, but in the 50s and in the early 60s, it's pro-segregation because that was the rules, those were the laws of the South, and it's against equity programs to aid in black success. So affirmative action and any kind of welfare and any kind of higher taxes on white people, richer people, or corporations in order to fund social services for poorer people, especially poorer minorities, is all rejected. And we see this throughout. We'll see this in Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush's presidencies, a complete dismantling of the social safety net for poor, especially minority peoples. But here's the thing. Well, I can say all those, that it's anti-Semitic, it's anti-gay, it's pro-dictator, and it's pretty racist. America was all of those things. America was anti-Semitic, but post-Holocaust, it was unpopular to be so. But you still got anti-Semitism all over America in the 50s and the 60s, and it was normal to be. It was a regular thing to kind of just, say it. America was anti-gay. But saying on TV to a famous writer, remember Gore Vidal was one of the biggest writers of the day when he has that debate. It was just gross. People went, don't need to hear that. And it made Buckley look small instead of high-minded. He was attacking the the lifestyle of his debate person instead of the debate person's ideas. 20 million Americans had served, 400,000 had died fighting dictators. So loving fascism was dead for a generation. You couldn't be a fascist. It's interesting now that fascism all over the West, in America, but also in Europe and Canada, is coming back now that World War II generation is dying. But there is always this kind of what the conservatives wanted or portray Reagan to be, though he's not. This idea of the strong, charismatic, masculine male who just runs the show by diktat. What Donald Trump promised to be. This idea when Donald Trump, in his acceptance speech for the Republican National Committee Conference, said, "I alone can fix it," and he got cheers. America's in so much trouble, but I alone can fix it. Well, that's a dictator. That's the language of a dictator. That's the language of a Caesar. And he got cheers from a bunch of people who are conservatives, who should be very wary of a strong government, who should want, from the very beginning of the founding, local control, states' rights, that a strong government is dangerous to the individual. We've talked about that over and over and over again in this class. Except when it comes to like their dictator, a conservative dictator. So this group becomes the heart of Nixon's silent majority. There's the idea of a middle-class suburban folk who think the 60s have gone too far. And in 1972, you get a conservative presidential victory that is almost as big as the 1964 liberal one for LBJ. Now, if you take a look at our map, electorally, it's a bigger victory, but it's not as big in the popular vote. It's close, but it's not as big. It's a closer one in the popular vote, but electorally, it's a blowout. So the idea is America is much more conservative in 1972 than a lot of people thought it was. That in 1964, in just 8 years, had completely changed. That the people who supported the New Deal, those middle-class people who supported the socialism of the New Deal, were turning their backs on it. They were thinking the 60s were crazy. It was going too far. They wanted the security of a conservative government. And what we see is white flight. White people, middle-class white people, start to leave the cities. Not start, because it had started in the 50s, but this is the final kind of wave. This is the last wave. They leave the cities, they leave neighborhoods that have people of color in them. We get a resegregation, especially in the North. And Chicago, the North, the Midwest, the Northern Midwest. We create whole new municipalities, whole new towns with high property taxes based on land ownership. And so American schools become more segregated by 1980, 85 than they were in 1950. You didn't have the laws segregating races anymore, but by economics. And a lot of this is a response to anti-busing. That the idea was that desegregation hadn't happened enough. And so school districts, states were going to have to be forced to do it. And so the idea was you were going to bus poor minority kids to richer, whiter districts. And you were going to bus richer, whiter kids to the poorer minority districts. And it was a shit show. There's no other way of saying it. It's such a problem that in 2020, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden got into a fight over busing. The legacy of busing. That Kamala Harris I was one of those girls who was bused, and it worked for me. And Joe Biden, you're one of those guys who voted against it. And he did. Why? Because his constituents were white people in the Delaware suburbs. They didn't want their kids to be sent to Wilmington schools. They were like, no, we live in a better neighborhood with better schools. Why would I want my kids sent to a worse school? For segregation, for desegregation, just to make some politician in Washington or judge happy. And so what you got was, you just moved. You just left the school district. You left the neighborhood. With that came redlining, which was a denial of public services, water, sewer, fire, police to certain areas. It was the idea that there were areas of cities, of places, that firemen, police, social services just wouldn't go. They were just going to not have it. And then banks, knowing that this was going on, wouldn't invest in those neighborhoods. And he drew little red lines on the maps. In this area, we will not give any loans. So there was no chance for renewal. Because all right, you have a house. I bought a house, right? I got to fix the roof. How am I going to fix the roof? Roof is going to be $20,000. Well, the answer is I go to the bank and I say, I need a loan for $20,000. And they look at my income. They look at, my last name. They look at my race. They look at my job. They look at my debts. And then they look at where the neighborhood is. What are the housing values? Are they likely to get repaid? Now, I'm an upper middle class, white, male professor. So the answer is I'm going to get that loan. Of course I'm going to get that loan. I'd be more mad if I didn't get the loan. I'd be like, what do you mean? I didn't get $20,000. Of course I'm going to get $20,000. Right? Because my home value is going to easily go up $20,000 because of the better house, because of the investment in the house. Right? And so of course the bank's going to get back its money. I'm a safe bet in a safe neighborhood because I'm in an upper middle class neighborhood full of upper middle class people, full of upper middle class houses that people want to buy into. So the home value is going to go up over time. But what if you can't get that loan? If I can't get that loan, I can't fix that roof, which means you have more leaks, you have more decay, you have more rot. Oh, now I have to replace not only the roof, but the attic. So now I need $50,000. Well, if I couldn't get a $20,000 loan, am I going to get a $50,000 loan? No. And so you get more damage and more decay and more rot. And then the parts of the roof fall into the attic. Then you have dripping into the second floor. Right? Pipes get frozen and then they burst. Now that's bad for my house, but what if that's happening to all of my neighbors? Do you want to move into that neighborhood? Would anyone want to buy my house? What happened to the value of my house? What had been a regular house, a $250,000 house, is now $50,000, which means I lost money. The bank lost money. The mortgage company lost money, which means I can't afford to sell because I owe $200,000 more. But the mortgage company won't invest in the neighborhood anymore because they don't think they're going to get their money back. And so it's this lack of investment, this lack of public services, so that houses burn and no one puts them out. We see this in the South Bronx. Very famously, the Yankees are playing playoff games, and the Bronx is on fire. The Bronx is burning. It's in a Billy Joel song, Miami 2017. We've passed. We're now in Miami 2022, but it always burned up there before. They burned the churches up in I think it's up in Harlem. I have to remember the lyrics. But it's about the Bronx being on fire. There's a very famous Howard Cosell being like, there's fires all over the Bronx. And nobody's putting them out. Well, because the fire departments wouldn't go into those neighborhoods. So success becomes getting out. Now listen to that term. Getting out. Get out. Does the movie Get Out? The idea is that you had to leave the place. You had to leave your family. You had to leave your friends. You had to leave the place you grew up in order to have success. You couldn't stay. Which meant if you, as white people moved out and you were left with more minorities, it meant success for the minorities meant leaving to move into more white neighborhoods. Well, if you move into a white neighborhood, then you have gone from a majority to now you're the minority culture. You're isolated. You're in a diaspora. And we live in the world of redlining. We live, even though it's technically not allowed anymore, we live in the world created by that. I'm going to show you that world in a moment. Even The Simpsons is segregated by race. Take a look at them in church. There's an episode where the Simpsons are in church. Maggie doesn't feel very well. And in church, it's all white people. Well, they're yellow, but they're all Caucasians in the Protestant church. And they ask, where's Dr. Hibbert? Oh, well, Dr. Hibbert's in the more boisterous, quote unquote, church on the other side of town. And they go in and it's all black people. It's all people of color in that church singing, "Let the light all shine on. Let the light shine on." And now Bart's like, oh, black Jesus is cool. This is awesome. I love black church. But that they're segregated. And there's a famous phrase that like 9 a.m. on a Sunday, America is the most segregated, is at its most segregated, is the most segregated country in the Western world. So America in the 1960s, late 60s, and especially in the 70s and into the 80s is resegregating. But instead of using laws, it's using wealth and education as a marker for race. Chris Rock has a bit where he says, in my neighborhood, there are 4 black people. And all of them are super successful. There's like Mary J. Blige, there's Eddie Murphy, there's him. And he's like, I had to host the Oscars in order to live next door to a dentist. He's like, think about that kind of neighborhood. It's like, he's a perfectly fine dentist. He's not a bad guy. He's a perfectly fine guy. But is he the greatest dentist ever? No. Did he host the Oscars of dentistry? No. But the idea was to live in what is a normal, rich, white neighborhood, you have to be an extraordinary person of color, is his point. And that's what we're seeing start up in the 1970s. That the neighborhoods are being left behind because there's no money, there's no services. Just compare Camden to Cherry Hill. They're about the same size, about 75,000 people each. Compare how many Starbucks are in Camden versus how many are in Cherry Hill. They're all over Cherry Hill. But there's one in Camden. Only one. And I know there's only one because it's at Camden County College's bookstore. It's ours. Which is awesome and sad at the same time. We don't get enough credit for having the only Starbucks in all of Camden City. We did that. Congratulations, Camden County College. We did that. But why are there 100 Starbucks in Cherry Hill? How many supermarkets? Again, in Cherry Hill, on Route 70, you could go from a Lidl German supermarket, little market, to a ShopRite, to a Wegmans, to a Whole Foods within a mile or two of each of the stores. Within a 2-mile, straight line. You go from basic German supermarket to Amazon-owned specialties, organic superfood place. So we see this biggest change is this segregation by wealth and education, the rise of super zip codes. And you know them. It's Moorestown. It's Haddonfield. It's Cherry Hill East. That race and wealth become intertwined and perpetuated by education, networks, lifestyle, and access to services. Richer people create space, which becomes a different universe for their children than the next zip code over, which means they have different experiences, different colleges, different jobs, a different spouse than they would have. That richer people start living together, educated together. They marry each other and they perpetuate that wealth to their kids. It equals that wealthier folk stay married longer. They have more money. Wealthy folk live longer because they have better access to healthcare, and better healthcare because they have more money. So again, they make more money. So you get generational wealth and more segregation. The super rich separate themselves from the rich. The rich separate themselves from the upper middle class. The upper middle class separate themselves from the middle and from the working class. And the working class separate themselves from the poor, which is exactly how Brave New World worked with the alphas and the betas and the gammas. In class, I'll go through a super zip code database called shiny.rstudio.com. And you could type in your zip code and see where it ranks. But I have 3 up here. I have Camden, downtown Camden. I have 5 miles of Haddon Avenue. Let's look at 5 miles of Haddon Avenue from downtown Camden to Collingswood to Haddonfield. And look at what happens in race. Downtown Camden, 65% African American. A mile away, across 130, in Collingswood, it's 89% white. A mile. You could walk that. If you rode your bike, you could easily do it. Remember, this is 5 miles from one end to the other. This isn't even training for a half marathon. You'd have to do it twice and more. And yet, it goes from 65% African American to 90% white. Another 2 miles up the road in Haddonfield, it's 95% white. People of Hispanic origin go from 35% in Camden to 3.5% to 4% in Haddonfield. Well, what about education? College degrees in downtown Camden go from 12% of people have a college degree or above. In Collingswood, it's 56%. In Haddonfield, it's 72%. Meanwhile, less than a high school diploma, people who have not finished high school, go from 30% in Camden to 4% in Collingswood to 2%, 1.5% in Haddonfield. And you're like, wow, this linkage of race and education, right? Now remember, there's no walls that keep people out. There's nothing stopping people from moving, from not moving, from walking from one zip code to the other. This is 5 miles. This is nothing. And yet now look at their incomes. Downtown Camden is $23,000 per year per person. In Collingswood, it's 4 times that, $89,000. And in New Jersey, in Haddonfield, it's $112,000. It's another 25% over Collingswood. It has gotten richer, it has gotten wider, and it has gotten better educated. Per capita income, what each person makes goes from $13,000 to $62,000. A 4.5, 5 times increase. And poverty, people living in poverty, in fact, the per capita income is a poverty level income. Population below the poverty line goes from 40% in downtown Camden to 3.5% in Haddonfield. And you go, well, who's poor in Haddonfield? Who's below the poverty line? And not knowing the demographics, not knowing more than what I'm showing you, I'm going to bet you, I would bet all the money in my pocket, it's older folk. It's people living on Social Security. They own their house, but they can't work anymore. They have medical bills, and so they're living Social Security check to Social Security check. But here's the point. What colleges are the kids in Cannon City going to go to? What colleges are the Collingswood kids going to go to? What ones can they afford? What about Haddonfield? Which ones? And if they go to those schools, right? Now remember, they live on a road, the same road, 5 miles of the same road. They're going to go to those colleges. What jobs are they going to get? What majors are they going to take? Who are they going to marry? Will those people ever live in the same neighborhood? Will their kids ever go to the same school? Will they ever vacation in the same place? No. They live in completely different universes. The kids who are in Camden High School will live their entire life in a completely different universe than the kids in Collingswood. And those kids are living in a completely different life than the kids in Haddonfield, which is why middle-class white folk are so desperate to buy into Haddonfield, into more expensive neighborhoods, which is why what raises the property values, which raises the property taxes, which makes it more exclusive, which makes it harder to buy into. But you want your kids to be able to network. You want your kids to be able to hang out with other people of a higher tax bracket. So that when they get married, they'll marry someone like that. That they could be pulled up. They could go to, they're not going to go to Camden County College. They're not even going to go to Rowan. They want to go to Princeton. But if they can't go to Princeton, they'll go, Villanova, Swarthmore. They're not going to go to Temple or Drexel. That's where the Collingswood kids might go, Rowan and Stockton. And so this is new. This wasn't happening before. You used to live in mixed neighborhoods with lots of different incomes, and there would be the nice neighborhood in the town, and there'd be the poorer part of the town, like literally on the other side of the tracks. But then all those kids went to the same school, and there was a hierarchy. There was a wealth hierarchy. But compare that to Mean Girls or Clueless. Or Will Smith in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, where the whole premise of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is that Will doesn't belong there. Will is completely outside of that class, that caste, that culture, even that black culture. And so for the first season of Fresh Prince, it was who's the real black person? Can rich people really be black? That's the first season of Fresh Prince. Because his claim is, I'm authentic. I'm living the black experience. I'm from Philly. I'm from the hood. I know what the black experience is. And you have Uncle Phil who's like, F that, man. You don't know. I listen to Malcolm X speak. I listen to Martin Luther King speak. I'm fighting the fight, and being successful doesn't make us any less black. That's the premise of Blackish, the TV show. How can you be rich and black at the same time? What does that do to your identity? And so in the early seasons of Blackish, it's the reason the show is called Ish. Is the son really black? That's the fear of the father. It's like, ah. And his grandfather, who's Lawrence Fishburne from the 70s, movies of the 70s, is like, dude, you're not at all. You got soft. You left it all behind. And so what we see is that we see a resegregation of America, but without any of the laws, just by economics. And then it's enforced by education, which is then enforced by property values and jobs. Now remember, we've taken a look. The median household income in Camden is $22,000, right? And it's $112 in Haddonfield per year. You have to multiply that by 50 years. Or at least 30 years, someone's going to be working. Really 40 years, right? From their 20s to their 60s, right? By 40. So it's what? $90,000 difference times 40. So let's do that. Let's do here. Siri, 90,000 times 40. That's $3.6 million extra in income if you live in Haddonfield. 3.6 million. Imagine what colleges you can go to on 3.6 million. Imagine what new houses you can buy on 3.6 million. Imagine what vacations you could take. Sure, you could go to the shore for a weekend, or you could buy a place down the shore for an investment. Or you go to Europe or Australia or Asia. You live in a different universe. Think about what the schools can do. Can you have a study abroad in Paris, in Camden? I'm sure Haddonfield does. Hey, your high school, go to Paris for a semester. Or at least a couple weeks. You know, your French class will go. And it will be expenses paid. You know, you buy your airfare, but, you know, we'll get a grant that will help promote that education. So by 1980, Reagan and his form of conservatism wins. And that form of conservatism wants to dismantle the New Deal. Now, the 70s are disruptive. Nixon wins, but Nixon's also got weird liberal parts to him. You go, oh, Nixon, and he liked the idea of Medicare for all. He liked the idea of a UBI, of a universal basic income. Because the idea was no one should live in poverty. Nixon had lived in poverty. And he didn't have the pull yourself up by your bootstraps. He had seen that it doesn't work. If you don't have bootstraps, you can't pull yourself up by them. So that the government can help. That's still the New Deal. But Nixon also was a conservative. And he gets involved in Watergate. And he's a bit of a criminal. And he's forced to resign. Then because of that, Carter wins in 1976 to become president. And so there's this little liberal interregnum. But Carter, while liberal, is also a Southern Democrat. So how liberal is he? And then in 1980, Reagan wins, solidifying kind of this conservative victory. So I have lived my entire life under really what is a conservative hegemony of the culture. You know. And the idea was to dismantle the New Deal, dismantle the welfare state, lower taxes for the rich, and the idea you would get trickle-down economics. Rich people would spend money that would create sales taxes, or they would donate and to give charity, and that would help poor people. Or they would invest, and poor people could get jobs in the new companies of those investments. The idea that wealth was not in work, like it was in the 50s, but in investments, was a very 19th century idea. So there's a love for the Gilded Age. It's very 1920s. The rich get super rich, especially on the stock market, as the stock market goes up. And this is the separation. This is where rich people separate themselves. This is where income inequality always, if you want to measure income inequality in the United States, you start in 1980, because that's where the lines just deviate. And it's almost all of that wealth is generated in the stock market. 50% of Americans are not in the stock market, have nothing in the stock market. So if the stock market goes up, 50% of Americans get nothing, no value in it whatsoever. 2, massive investment in the military. The U.S. will become the next 10 countries combined. 3, massive debts to keep voters voting for conservatives. See, the thing about the Reagan and the conservatives is we're fiscally responsible, but the numbers never bear that out. Conservatives have as big, if not bigger, debts. Why? Because they want to cut taxes, but they don't want to cut services. They say they'll cut services, and they mean cut services for poor people of color. But here's the thing. There's lots of white people who are on those services. Oh, you want to cut welfare? Great. The average person on welfare is a rural, southern, white family. How do you cut welfare? You need to win West Virginia. How do you cut welfare? These are conservative places that also like their help, need their help. There's a lot of poor white people in the country because there's more white people at this point. So white conservatives still get government services. You get Medicare, Social Security, FEMA, Farm Aid. And every time the conservatives start talking about we're going to cut Social Security, they back away because their constituents go, whoa, you can't do that. So you get federal redistribution of taxes to poorer states. New Jersey gets its least money back. It gets 80 cents on the dollar. We pay $1 in taxes. We get 80 cents of that back. Meanwhile, Alabama gets $2.50 back for every dollar they give to the federal government. So who's on welfare? Right? Rich Democratic liberal states are paying, literally paying, for conservative states to survive, to stay conservative. They're subsidizing rural conservative states. And so what this shows to us is culture matters more than economics. Because why do conservatives keep voting for a party that would, like in the 1920s, ruin the economy, raise big debts, let rich people get super rich and hurt themselves? There's a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, which asks this question. Why are Kansas people voting conservative when it's not in their economic best interest? And the answer is culture matters to them more. They don't care about the economics as much. They're doing well enough economically. And what do they care about? Being anti-gay, anti-liberal, anti-feminist, anti-change. And so the idea of the culture is the past was better. And liberals are the real problem for wanting to change things. So when I was a kid, it was women and gays. And now it's trans. And it's still women and gays, let's face it. And it was Jews. Liberal Jews were commies when I was a kid. They're not really American, right? There's something suspicious about Jewish Americans. They didn't go to church. We went to something called synagogue, and no one understood what that was. And so the idea was going back to the past. The past was better. 1950s is really the idealized time. So conservatism wins. It won. By the 1990s, it had won. It had elected Nixon in 68, Nixon again in 72. It had lost in 76, won again in 80, 84, 88. So you're talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 presidential elections out of 6 from 1968 to 1992. So that by 1991, communism was defeated. The USSR, the Soviet Union, fell apart. The Cold War was won. There's a whole propaganda part that Reagan won the Cold War. Tell that to the Soviets. American corporations were the largest and richest in the world. The U.S. in 1991 had more billionaires than the rest of the world. Unions, except for the public ones, were essentially extinct. In 1965 or 1955, it had been 30% of the workforce. Now it's 6%. The only thing that's where the strong unions are left are in education, police, the trades, and government. A conservative Supreme Court starts rolling back civil rights acts, the Voting Rights Act, and gun laws. Even Bill Clinton, a Democrat, the Liberal Party, signs laws that cause mass incarceration for black men, signs Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and makes gay marriage illegal, also signs workfare. The idea that if you're going to be on welfare, you have to have a job. Well, what if you're in a depression or a recession and there are no jobs? Doesn't matter. You have to have a job to get welfare. Think about how different we are from Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's not a liberal. He's a Democrat, yes, but he's a conservative. He's center right. This is why the whole idea that Hillary Clinton is like some liberal pinko commie is like, she's a conservative. She's center right. It just tells you how far the modern Republican Party has gone into conservatism, has gone to the right. But it won. Liberals can't be liberal. They have to be some kind of Republican light. And we see this all over. And this is the constant debate. This was the constant debate in the 2020 election. Do you be a socialist like Bernie Sanders or a Republican light like Joe Biden? Who can win? Now, what's funny is that Joe Biden, having then won the nomination, kind of tacked to the left, became more liberal, became more progressive, or said he was going to be more progressive, which was kind of interesting. But the idea is, how did liberals win? Do they win by being liberal? 1964, Lyndon Johnson. We're going to solve poverty. We're going to help women. We're going to help minorities. We're going to educate disadvantaged people. We're going to raise people's living. We're going to use government to cure ills. Or do you be like Republican light, where you say, things are fine, but we should change some things? The classic definition of conservative. That's Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin, when faced with Build Back Better plan, when build $1 trillion of social investment, free community college, more health care, more education, said no, things are fine the way they are. We don't need to invest $1 trillion. That's conservative. And he's a Democrat. He's the party of Lyndon Johnson. But conservatism has so won in America that even the liberals aren't liberal. By 1964 standards, by Nixon standards, there's nobody saying we should have a UBI, a universal basic income, where the government just pays people. Nobody's saying that. Very few people. So if you're a liberal, you're looking around going, yeah, but nobody's really liberal anymore. There are no Lyndon Johnsons. There are no Roosevelts. There's not even a Norman Rockefeller, who was a Republican, but is more liberal than most of the Democrats in Congress today. So what's the problem? Well, the problem for conservatism is it won. It won. So what's the problem? Well, now having won, it has to figure out what does it do? How does it survive? What does it stand for? Some of its problems are old problems. It likes dictators. It doesn't really like democracy. See Republicans and Putin. Now, when I wrote this lecture, it was before the Ukraine war. But even during the Ukraine war, my Twitter feed is full of conservatives who are like, Putin's not so bad. He had a point. Maybe invading Ukraine wasn't such a bad idea. It's what strong leaders do. He had to make a decision. And it's like, they don't like democracy. We see this in the laws, the voting laws that are all over conservative states today, making it harder and harder and harder for people to vote. So that they want the right people to vote, and who vote the right way. Another problem is women are getting more educated. Like this, you can't stop. Women are actually getting more PhDs than men and have been since 2001, which means they're having less children because they're spending more time getting more degrees and then starting businesses or working. So they're having less children, which gives them more money for independence. They're not reliant on a man. And women like socialism. It's not a surprise that the squad, quote unquote, of the 4 liberal women are liberal women in Congress, because it's childcare, it's equal pay, it's rights to the body, it's traditional liberalism from the progressives from 1900 on of using government to help gain equity. That if women are just left to their own devices, they'll always be behind men. Because they have to have children. They have to take care of children. They get stuck with childcare. And so even for conservative women, in their hearts of hearts, they like socialism. They like the help. So the earned income tax credit is basically a child welfare tax deduction, without saying it's a child welfare tax deduction. Third, boomers are aging out of existence. They are the largest population in the United States. They are this big, huge mass that in the 60s was liberal and in the 80s became conservative as they bought property, as they moved into the suburbs, as they had kids themselves. And so they are reliably conservative voters, but they are becoming a smaller share of the voting groups as they become a smaller share of the population. And this is traumatic because boomer culture is American culture right now, and it has been. You can see this in the millennials are killing lists. Like millennials aren't getting married, so they're killing the diamond industry. And it's always like they're killing things boomers loved. So it means conservatism has to change, because the conservatism that we have is a boomer-based cultural conservatism. It's a conservatism that likes the 1950s and the early 1960s as this ideal time of peace and tranquility. Even though those were liberal times, don't get me started on that. But it's this idea that their childhood was better. Well, they're dying. So what you're left with is Generation X or the older millennials who have a different relationship, having grown up in conservatism. They have a different relationship to it. America's becoming more diverse as people have less children, and we continue to have immigration from Central and South America and the Middle East and East Asia and South Asia. America becomes more diverse, and by 2050, it will be less white. It will go from 85% white in 1965 to 45%. It will be more Asian. It will be about 10% in 2050. It will be more Hispanic, about 30% of people. So companies will want and need to diversify to gain customers. You see this in commercials now. The amount of commercials I see that have mixed race families blows my mind. Because having grown up in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, you never saw that. Remember, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Friends, Seinfeld, there are no black characters. There are no Hispanic characters. It is a group of friends who are all white. Well, now you see it in commercials. Commercials are selling a more diverse family unit, saying our product is for you. But the ultimate problem for conservatism in 2020 is, what does it want? Donald Trump got elected with the slogan, "Make America Great Again," which was Ronald Reagan's slogan, which was itself a slogan from the 1950s, which was again from the 1920s. But when was it great? You want to make it great again, but when? President Trump never articulated when it was great. I think he thought it was the 1980s, because he was younger then. He was rich. He was taken seriously. He could write an op-ed and the Daily News would publish it. He was at all the big parties. So I think he thinks it's the 1980s when he became rich and the stock market made him rich. But a lot of the people who voted for him wanted to be the 1950s. Corporations wanted to be the 1920s, when they had a lot more freedom and a lot less regulation. But is it 1985? Is it 1955? Is it 1895, the Gilded Age? Is it 1855, with all its implications for minorities? Like, when you say, I want America to go back to when it was great, well, you have to articulate a time. What do you mean? And conservatism has a tough time saying that, because when you put a time to it, when you say 1955, you go, so you like segregation, right? You like gays in the closet. You like women at home. And you then have to say yes or no to that response. And so conservatism is going to have to change. So does conservatism have a future? Probably, but that future will be different. We'll get an era of liberalism to create a new consensus that consensus will become the new conservatism. That's probably what's going to happen. You'll get a lot of change rapidly as the boomers die, because the hold on all the voting and changing in the Senate and in the House will change. And you'll get this era of liberalism. We're seeing it. We saw it with COVID. Suddenly spending lots of money, trillions of dollars, became easier for social programs. That said, at some point, people will say that's enough. I like it the way it is, and you'll get this new conservatism, and that will last for a generation. So that will probably happen. But I don't know. But we don't know. We don't know. If you were to say, Professor Gennari, you're going to live your entire life under a conservative cultural concept, you'd be like, no, that's crazy. And yet I look at my life and go, that's probably what's going to happen. I'm going to be an old man, and we'll finally have our first liberal president. And I'll be like, oh, wow. And then I'll die, of old age. And even if that happens, there'll be a boomer who's still 110 years old yelling at me about how times were better when they were young. So anyway, that's American conservatism since 1965. It wins. It starts from being completely defeated because of the Great Depression and the Second World War, to winning and becoming the cultural mindset, the language we speak. Notice it's cutting taxes. Taxes are bad. When the news talks about taxes, do you want to raise taxes? They never call it investments. They never say, do you want to invest more in the American child by subsidizing education? No, they say, do you want to raise taxes? Well, that's a conservative argument. That's a conservative language. So we live in that. That's the victory. The victory of conservatism is not necessarily what it did in its laws. It's what it did to the language. It was what it did on how you think about things. So, take care. Be safe. I'll see you soon.